Thirty-three minutes after the hour of 8 a.m. Central Time, where we are, Fred Dashevsky is on the East Coast, so it's actually 9:33 his time. Always a pleasure to have him on the show because he has studied psychology, poli-sci, and economics, and knows his stuff. He's been in the numismatic business for over 40 years, dealing in rare U.S. gold and silver coins, and he understands the landscape. Welcome back to the show, sir. Always a pleasure to have you on.
Hey, good morning. Great to see you again.
Well, and here's the thing. Right before we went on, I was throwing some stuff out there, and here's the thing. You may be coming into some money soon, and you need to pay attention to this because we've got a deal, and you need to pay attention. Everything that we're going to be talking about is fundamentally important. You just heard Fred's commercial right here if you're listening to us during the break. You can't ask for better timing, Fred, because of the fact that, he has deals going on, and people... This week, the Biden administration was warned by the International Monetary Fund. Now, this is the banking cartels. Come on. We talked about the banking cartels' history and their infiltration into America and how they got us all in the fiat money system, where we are right now, how they've made us reliant on it, how it's, basically what we the people say the value of it is as far as our standard and store of value. Fred understands it. I understand it. But when the IMF comes out and tells the Biden administration this deficit spending, you're hitting your wall here. I mean, are we over leveraged right now?
Well, this is getting a little disconcerting because I think we've talked about this a lot. The real fundamental value in the U.S. dollar at this point really is about psychology. It's about a joint confidence in the ability of the U.S. government to maintain its ability to pay its bills. And when the government is deficit spending at record levels, it raises eyebrows. They're hosting auctions, and I know we talked about this a month or two ago when there were a couple auctions that crossed the $60 billion mark. They're going to have an auction this morning. It's going to be $70 billion worth of 5-year notes. And what really is troubling, and I think this is really worth thinking about, the problem is when the government is financing debt in short-term moments, they're not stretching this out for 30 years like a mortgage and saying, okay, we've got decades to pay this off and we can incrementally do that. They are financing the government more and more on the short-term basis of the yield curve. So the tremendous amount of debt load that the U.S. government is pumping out there in the form of these bonds has to be paid to the bondholder when those bonds mature. And when you're financing stuff on 2-year bases or 5-year bases, that is going to go by in a heartbeat. And every time they sell more and more of these bonds, what the public ought to understand is that that's going to translate into the need to print all that in terms of new capital to pay that bondholder when the bond comes due. If you're willing to invest in that 5-year note or that 2-year note, at the end of the 2 years, you expect to get paid. And I think what the IMF is starting to point out is that a lot of governments have played this game to their detriment. They have been enabled to make the payments as they come due. And once you hit a default problem or the threat of a default problem, what is left fundamentally to support the value of your currency? It comes down to what your country can produce. And at this point, the GDP cannot account for the amount of deficit spending. So I can understand why the IMF is getting concerned. They're looking at a worldwide situation. It's no better anywhere else in the world. But if we are the strongest, and we are, it's still king dollar out there. We represent the best of what's possible. And if we're faltering, that doesn't look good for the overall environment.
That's scary. And that, for the IMF to come out and tell them, look, this deficit spending is getting out of hand here, folks. You need to stop it. And then what is our government just passes a $95 billion? I'm like, what are these people doing?
Bill.
Who's paying for this? This is the problem. America's taxpayers, including our listeners of the show, Fred, are freaking out. Yep. They're like, look, our kids are not going to be able to pay this debt off. Everything Jefferson said about waking up as slaves on the land our forefathers conquered is going to come true. And we're just like, look, these people, we have to stop this. One way to do it. And you've from what I understand, had some people calling concerned. And this is the beauty about this toll-free number, 1-800-878-2646. If you're not writing it down, you should be. Get your pen and paper because we'll give you the number again. Fred's people are there, including Fred himself, to answer your questions about concerns regarding the price of gold and silver, where they're at, what spot is, what premiums are. the thing is now the calls before we went on the show, Fred, you were talking about the calls you're getting, and the nature of it is people are concerned about, well, am I buying gold too high right now, or do you think gold's going to go higher?
Well, that's a question that comes up frequently, but honestly, I've been answering that question since gold was $500 an ounce. So it's all relative. There are market ranges that every commodity, including gold, trade within, and the gold market has been on a tear lately. In fact, I've been waiting for a little bit of a pullback, which we got yesterday. We did see it tap $2,400 several times. We're at 2,320 today. So that's a little bit of a pullback. But if you look at it, it is a ratcheting thing. So it goes up, it may drop back a little bit, then it goes a little higher, it drops back a little bit, it goes higher. In the end, for those that are playing this correctly, which in my opinion is a 5-year hold or longer, it never becomes relevant because it progressively becomes more valuable over the years as we move forward because certain situations are not changing. And one of those is that the government is continually deficit spending. But as you pointed out, and the IMF is now pointing out, the pace of this is becoming alarming. We're not merely deficit spending a small percentage of the GDP, it's becoming a greater and greater percentage, which means we have to generate more revenue somehow in order to compensate for the gap. And the only ways for government to do that, they could, of course, crank up your taxes. I mean, they could just turn to the public and say, look, we're out of money, folks, and you're just not paying enough to cover what we're spending. We want to continue to keep spending, so I'm sorry, we're going to have to charge you because we can't control our spending habits. You're going to have to buck up more money. Or the government can turn around in a political year and try to suggest that they're going to cut some of the services that government provides. So they're going to wipe out part of the public wealth and health care by telling people they simply can't afford to continually pay into programs that don't generate revenue. That's kind of political suicide. So the government doesn't have a lot of options. And I've been saying this for the last year or two. I see the only option left is to print money. And I think that's what they're going to do. But these bond sales, I think this is really important. If they were pumping this stuff out 20 years out, 30 years out, not that I expect that they could solve the problem in the time frame, but at least they're buying time. But when we're doing the bulk of the sale of all the government debt on the short-term basis of the scale, that is really difficult to manage. And then when 2 years from now, 2022 was 2 years ago. 2026 is going to come by before you blink. And all these debt instruments being sold out into the market today are going to be redeemable, which means we have to have the capital available to print and pay off those bondholders. This is becoming progressively difficult for the government because they just can't seem to control the deficit spending, on top of which now, of course, we're adding foreign aid programs and everything that seems to come up day after day that adds to the pile.
But the other thing that we're concerned about is, what they do to rob Peter to pay Paul and then kick the can down the road, which is exactly what they're doing because Powell is not going to decrease interest rates. That's pretty much a given at this point. The bigger problem that we have now is who's cashing in on their bonds, who's buying more bonds, who's selling more bonds. I mean, China's economy is faltering as well. The commercial shoe in America is dropping. There's more and more foreclosures in the commercial markets. I mean, this is not a good thing for America's economy, given all this deficit spending. Economically, where do we sit here in all this?
Well, we sit in a situation where we're progressively relying more and more on our ability to sell more debt. And that's really kind of a dangerous thing. It's like an individual who has to continually find new friends to borrow money from. Yeah. If you can keep building the pile of new friends and say, hey, would you be my buddy? Great. Nice to meet you. And by the way, can I borrow a few dollars from you? Because I've already tapped everybody else that I know for everything they're willing to lend me because I haven't been able to pay them back yet. And I still need to borrow more. And I'm spending so much more money. I better find a bunch of new friends really quickly. So the U.S. government has got to entice people to buy government debt. Now, a lot of foreign countries do this because of the stability of the dollar relative to their currency. So they may yield, 4% on a 2-year note or 4.5% on a 5-year note. It's guaranteed by the U.S. government, and these foreign entities believe the government will pay them in the end. So for them, it makes some sense to stockpile some of their debt in that form. Institutional buyers are also big purchasers of U.S. government debt because, again, they have lots of capital to work with. The hedge funds have got billions upon billions of dollars. They've got to park it somewhere. And people want something conservative because if the stock market gets a little, cattywampus, people are going to look for something a little more secure. So bonds become an alternative. So you have individual buyers in America that are willing to say, I'll finance my government because I believe they'll pay me back. You have institutional investors that are doing this with massive amounts of capital, and foreign governments that almost by default can't find a better resource to park their capital than to buy debt from a U.S. Treasury Department with a government that's 34 trillion in debt and spending so much money that the interest payments now are becoming problematic. This is fundamentally completely backward in a way to run an economy. They've talked about the idea of going back to a gold standard, but every economist who looks at it says, no, there's absolutely no way you can do it. It's just not even feasible. Why bother even talking about it? We need to continue this fiat system because we simply can't afford to lock down anything that would constrain our ability to burn money at the rate we're paying. But I do find this problematic, and I think for Americans, the answer is just don't count on this paper money to support the value of you and your family in the future at the same level it's operating today. We have to understand and expect that the paper money we're currently using is going to buy less over the years. And we can compensate and counterbalance that with the physical ownership of gold and silver coins. And I highly encourage people to diversify their wealth to at least have some of this as part of their portfolio.
Well, if you're coming into money, folks, and a lot of you are cashing out 401ks or, sitting on a pension, and you've got a nest egg and you got $100,000 in the bank. And we have always talked about, and we have on this show previously about, splitting off about 15% of that. And if you've got 100 grand sitting in the bank right now, which some of you do, some of you don't, but the ones who do, this you should be paying very close attention, because Fred has a way. And it's not all 15%. It's more like about 13% of that $100,000. The whole idea is to diversify the portfolio. That's a good thing, considering what a lot of these hedge funds are doing. You brought up hedge funds, and I'm looking at the fact that we're into the quadrillions of dollars in these hedge funds of basically risked securities. And they're created basically the same way that a lot of our credit is created, out of thin air. And people, if you understand and you haven't read Modern Money Mechanics, you need to do that. That's a 40-page piece that was put out by the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago way back when. And so, that's available if you want to go searching for it. You can get on the same page as Fred real quickly, by understanding how mechanics of our money system works. And then you'll understand why it makes sense to invest in gold and silver.
I think the more people understand the nature of what you're discussing, which is how money works in America, how does it come into being? What value does it have? What constitutes its future value? The more that you get about that, the more this idea of not having that as your only source of wealth is going to make sense. Even on the periphery, I get people who have a faint understanding, and it harkens me back to when I was young and I first began to stumble into this concept. Something intrinsically just went off in my head, like a little bell that said, there's something flawed with this process of printing money that's not backed by something. I mean, even as a kid, I could understand that. But the nature of it today has become seriously complicated. And I think a lot of that is done on purpose to help, confuse the nature of things with people. And things get so complicated, people don't want to delve into it because they think it might just be overwhelming. There's so much information to try to gather together to get an understanding. But keep in mind, the basics are fairly simple. The value of money in America is based upon how much of this money exists. It's really what it comes down to. So if the supply of money increases, but the growth of the economy does not match that growth in the supply of money, the difference between the two is a loss in value. And this is the problem we're currently experiencing. We have a government spending more money than it brings in. This is what they refer to as deficit spending. So the government is already spending more money than it's currently bringing in. And the rate at which money is increasing is much more rapid than the growth of the overall economy. So if we look at the GDP, which is the output of everything America produces in a year, and we compare that to the amount of money that's been added to the system, the difference is getting wider and wider every year. That is not a good thing for the American public. It's very problematic. And as you mentioned earlier, it's getting to a point where even the International Monetary Fund, which is basically the central bank to the central banks. In other words, they are there when the country completely falls apart and they have no resources to get any capital, they can go begging to the IMF and say, hey, we're part of the world. We've contributed to the IMF. It's sort of an emergency kind of banking system. Please bail us out. And several countries have utilized IMF loans time and time and time again. Rarely do they ever get repaid, by the way. So most of them end up defaulting on the loans. But if we're at a point where the IMF is the only source left to help save the country,
we're in trouble.
We're kind of in trouble.
Well, see, and it all comes down to, and what I'm holding up on the screen right here, this has what we call extrinsic value as opposed to this, which has intrinsic value. And Fred, you brought up intrinsic before when you started to realize what the difference is. This is a debt note. It says right there, Federal Reserve note right on the top. What's a note? It's a promise to pay. It's evidence of debt, but they call it legal tender for all debts, public and private. Now, understand, the only reason that this exists is because we, the people, say we put our full faith and credit and our full faith and value in that particular debt note. And all we're doing when we go to the grocery store and we pay for groceries with a $20 bill is we're passing that debt on to somebody else.
It's an IOU. So
yeah.
I give you an IOU and say, okay, I owe you $1,000, and you take my IOU and you want to present it to somebody else because you want to purchase something with it. Well, that somebody else has to know me or believe in you one way or the other in order to accept my IOU. And the more hands it trades through, the weaker it's going to get because it's moving away from its original source. So it becomes progressively problematic. But if we all accept the IOU as having value, the game will continue. It's like musical chairs. The music is playing. Everything will appear fine. And I'm kind of likening the economy these days to, I hate to say it, but it's like a Boeing airplane. Everything's working great until the door blows off when you're at 35,000 feet. Then you have a problem. So, we're all flying in this plane that we know that there's some issues with, and, something may or may not fall off, and maybe we land safely and we get off our flight and it all worked. And then the next guy is taking the risk. So, yeah. I'm kind of looking at the situation as a very analogous.
No, it is. It is extremely. And I'm glad this is one of the reasons why I'm glad we have you on the show, Fred. And so those of you that are looking now, if you just want to, like me, I'm one of these guys that, look, it's like, okay, some of us are paupers out here. We're not made of money. We've been self-employed all our life. And some of us have done well. Some of us have done fair. And we have a way to invest in ourselves. And that's why, I'm a big junk silver fan. Like these half dollars, the dimes, the quarters. I mean, these are going to be negotiable on the open market if all hell breaks loose, and we need it. Are we dealing with minimums at your store?
$1,000 is our minimum order just because of time and shipping issues. So we do have to maintain that. But I do have a lot of people that do, pick up a little bit here and there whenever they have a couple extra dollars, and they are diligent about it, and they are accumulators, which is, I think, the best way to do this, as opposed to the speculator who wants to come in and say, I want to put $1 million into gold because I think it's going to $5,000 because I heard somebody on the internet say it's going to $5,000 next month.
And that's just never know.
That's not the way to invest. It's just not the way to do it.
I know.
This is about wealth accumulation, wealth protection, and diversification. But again, I would go back to the idea, anybody who's taken any kind of look at the way the U.S. dollar functions would have to accept the notion it's better to hold some gold and silver coins.
For sure. 1-800-878-2646. Fred Dashevsky, thanks so much for joining us. See you tomorrow.